In the Pacific War of 1943, the ocean did not care about flags or nations. It only listened to steel groaning under pressure and the wind that carried the smell of cordite across the waves and into the lungs of the young men who served aboard the newest American destroyers. The sailors of the United States Navy, many of them barely 20 years old, stepped onto the decks of the Fletcher-class ships with a mixture of fear, anticipation, and something close to pride. For months they had heard rumors whispered from ship to ship that these new destroyers were different, built not only to fight, but to survive the kind of punishment that would tear older vessels apart. Their hulls stretched more than 100 meters from bow to stern, and beneath the paint and rust streaks lay layers of steel bracing and compartmentalized engineering that naval architects believed would hold even if hit by bombs, torpedoes, or shell fire. The Pacific itself became the proving ground for these ambitions. A sky blue and inviting in the distance could turn dark with Japanese aircraft in minutes. A calm sea could hide minefields or submarines. The early years of the war had been brutal, as America struggled to find answers to the tactics of the Imperial Japanese Navy, and every sailor knew that the cost of every mistake was paid in wreckage and bodies drifting among burning oil. The Fletcher class arrived in this crucible like fresh blood and a wounded force. They carried 5-inch guns with rapid-fire capability, 2 twin rudders for sharper maneuvering, and boilers that could push them past 35 knots through seas churning with shrapnel and spray. But the greatest weapon they carried was not mechanical. It was the stubborn refusal of their crews to surrender to fear or misfortune. This spirit became legendary long before the sailors themselves realized it. In 1943, the Solomon Islands campaign dragged on with an intensity that few at home could imagine. The nights were infamous here. The darkness over the jungle-drenched coastline was inky and absolute. The only light came from tracer rounds, anti-aircraft bursts, and the thin sliver of moon hidden behind drifting clouds. Radar screens glowed faintly in the combat information centers of these destroyers, casting pale circles of greenish light onto nervous faces as operators tracked contacts that appeared and vanished like ghosts. The young men on deck could not see the approaching danger, but they could hear it, the distant rising hum of Japanese engines somewhere in the night. They had learned to listen for it the way a farmer listens for an approaching storm. And each time that sound rose, their hearts pounded, because they knew the Japanese attacked without hesitation, low, fast, and armed with bombs designed to tear open metal like paper. The story of the unsinkable destroyer does not begin with defiance or triumph, but with vulnerability. Even the toughest hulls seemed small in those black waters. Even the most experienced captains felt the weight of responsibility pressing on their backs. The men at the ready rooms tightened their life jackets, checked their helmets, and steadied themselves near their guns, while the officers shouted orders and the ship leaned as it accelerated to battle speed. Spray slashed across the bow, cold as winter despite the tropical heat. Below decks, engineers wiped their foreheads with oily rags and prayed the boilers held, while damage control teams stood by with hoses, pumps, and steel shoring beams ready to seal off whatever hole the next attack might punch into the ship. And yet something was changing. A belief was forming among the crews that these destroyers could take hits that would cripple any other ship. Maybe it was the reports filtering in from other task forces, stories of Fletchers limping back to port with gaping wounds still smoking. Maybe it was the sight of their own ship still steaming after surviving brushes with torpedoes or near misses. But more than anything, it was the way these vessels felt alive beneath them, a deep vibration through the soles of their boots that seemed to say, "Hold fast, I am built for this." By the late months of 1943, the sailors had begun calling their ships fighters, not escorts. They felt like they were riding on something that could outrun death if they pushed hard enough. And in the Solomon Islands, they would soon face the kind of trial by fire that would either break that belief or etch it forever into history. Before the night raid at Bougainville, before the bomb hits on USS Stanley, before the cruel explosion that tore the stern from USS Abner Reed, there was only this quiet certainty spreading ship to ship through the fleet, a certainty born not of arrogance but of experience, that even when the sky rained fire, these ships would not yield, that even when steel bent and water flooded in, they would refuse to sink, and that the young Americans who lived and fought aboard them were ready to learn what their ships were truly made of. As the scene closes, the darkness over the Solomons thickens. The radar begins to pick up faint contacts. The engines shift to full power. The captain steps onto the bridge, leaning forward as if staring into a future none of them can predict. The first alarm bell rings. The men rush to battle stations. And somewhere in that great black silence, the legend of the unsinkable destroyer is about to be born. The night over Bougainville, on that November evening in 1943, felt heavier than the sea itself, as if the darkness had weight and intention. The men aboard USS Stanley, DD-478, could sense it long before radar confirmed anything. The Pacific Campaign had taught them that silence was rarely safety. In the Solomons, silence was the breath before the storm. The destroyer moved through the black water, escorting transports toward Cape Turriquina, her wake glowing faintly with phosphorescence that made the ship look like a pale streak of light cutting across a vast, endless void. Above the deck, the air smelled of warm salt and engine exhaust. Below the deck, the bulkheads hummed with the steady pulse of boilers pushing steam through the heart of the vessel. Every man aboard felt that pulse, as if the ship itself were alive and bracing for what was coming. Radar operators stared at the green glow of their screens, eyes dry and aching as faint contacts flickered in and out like ghosts slipping between worlds. One operator leaned forward and whispered to the officer beside him, "There they are." The blips multiplied, then strengthened, approaching from the northwest. The Japanese were coming again. The alarm rang, battle stations, the cry echoing through passageways and ladders. The calm ship erupted into motion. Men sprinted to guns, strapped on helmets, checked belts of ammunition, and swung turrets to bear on the dark sky. At Mount 52, a gunner assistant named Charles Miller tried to steady his breathing the way he had been taught. Slow in, slow out. But nothing about this night felt slow. The tension rose like a tide. Officers shouted ranges, spotters scanned the sky, and the captain of USS Stanley brought the ship to flank speed, turning her bow toward open water so she could maneuver freely when the attack hit. The first sign of the enemy was not visual, but auditory. Engines, low and fast, came slicing through the night, a sound that made every man on deck stiffen. The Japanese pilots flew skillfully, hugging the darkness until the last second. Then the sky erupted. The first aircraft dove with a shriek, its silhouette visible only when tracer fire streaked upward like furious fireflies. Gun crews opened fire, the roar of 5-inch guns shaking the entire ship. Shell casings clattered on steel decks, the air filled with smoke, flashes, and shock waves. But the Japanese were not deterred. A bomb dropped from the first attacker missed wide, but the second plane lined up perfectly before anyone could blink. The bomb hit with a sound that was not an explosion at first, but a metallic scream as it tore through the starboard side of the ship. A moment later, the blast ripped through the interior. The deck convulsed, men were thrown from their feet, lights flickered, water sprayed through ruptured pipes, and a wave of dust and smoke rolled down the passageway. A second bomb slammed into the ship near the aft section, crashing through the deck plates. The impact shook Stanley so violently that even men in the engine rooms felt the jolt through the soles of their boots. One bomb exploded. One did not. But both hits felt like the ship had been punched by the fist of the ocean itself. For a few seconds, no one knew if she would stay afloat. Then the damage control teams moved like instinct. Men scrambled to isolate compartments, shut valves, tap fires, and rig shoring to hold weakened beams. They had practiced this 100 times, but nothing compared to doing it for real, in the dark,
with the smell of burning fuel and the taste of fear on the tongue. On the bridge, the captain steadied himself, gripping the rail as reports flooded in. Starboard flooding, but controllable. Aft hit, but guns still operational. Engine rooms intact, boilers holding. That last report was everything. The ship still had power. She still had maneuverability. And as long as she lived, she could fight back. The Japanese planes came again, diving low, but now every surviving gun on Stanley locked onto them. The destroyer spat fire into the night. The 5-inch guns thundered in angry rhythm. Smoke rose from the barrels of the twin 40s and 20s. Men shouted ranges, corrections, warnings. It felt less like a battle and more like the ship herself was howling against the odds. When the next plane appeared, descending at a steep angle, a gun crew on the port side fired a perfect burst. The aircraft caught fire mid-air, its burning frame spiraling into the waves. A second attacker lined up on the bow, only to be shredded by overlapping tracers that stitched its fuselage until it plunged into the waves. The third came in fast from aft turn, trying to slip into a blind spot, but the aft gun crews turned their mounts so quickly that one loader tore muscles in his shoulder. Yet they fired, and the plane disintegrated in a flash of flame and falling debris. 3 down. The attack was over, almost as suddenly as it had begun. The dark sky emptied. The sounds faded. The ship continued forward, leaving behind scattered pieces of aircraft burning on the surface of the sea. Only then did the crew allow themselves to breathe. USS Stanley had been hit twice directly. Bomb strikes that should have crippled her, should have silenced her guns, should have forced her from battle. Yet in the space of minutes, she had destroyed 3 enemy aircraft and remained in formation, still escorting, still fighting, still alive. Below decks, men covered in soot and sweat patched holes, welded plates, drained flooding, and carried wounded brothers to the infirmary. Above decks, the sailors stared at the twisted metal around them, the scorch marks, the missing railings, the shrapnel gouges, and they felt something new. Not just relief, not just fear, something stronger. A belief that their ship could take what would have sunk others, that maybe the rumors about the Fletcher class were more than stories. As dawn prepared to rise hours later, the men of USS Stanley stood on a deck still warm from battle, watching the horizon glow. They had been tested. They had been hit. They had survived. And they knew this was only the beginning.
The story of USS Abner Reed began like many other destroyers of the Pacific Fleet. But the night of August 18, 1943, in the cold, haunted waters off Kiska would mark her forever. On that night, the sea was calm and deceptive, a sheet of dark glass stretching beneath a low sky heavy with mist. The Aleutian Islands were nothing like the Solomons. No warm breeze, no tropical scents, only cold wind, the taste of salt, and a silence so deep it felt like the world was holding its breath. The men aboard Abner Reed, DD-526, had grown used to that silence. They had been sweeping for mines since dusk, watchful, impassive, moving slowly through waters that the Japanese had laced with hidden killers. No one hated mines more than destroyer crews. They were the one weapon you could not outmaneuver, no matter how skilled the helmsman was. And that night, the Japanese had left behind a gift that no one saw coming. The ship cut through the water, steady and disciplined, her wake trailing in a thin white line behind the stern. Engineers tended the boilers. Damage control crews stood ready on alert, but relaxed just enough to breathe. Above them, the deck crews scanned the horizon, seeing nothing, hearing nothing. Only the faint hum of the ship and the occasional clang of metal against metal broke the stillness. Some men whispered quietly. Some thought of home. Some rubbed their hands together to fight the Aleutian cold. A few laughed softly to shake nerves that never completely left any sailor in mine waters, but most simply listened to the night. It was almost peaceful. Then the world ended. A blast erupted beneath the stern with a force that lifted the entire aft section into the air. The deck buckled as if struck by a giant hammer. A deafening roar swallowed all other sound. The ship shook violently, throwing men against bulkheads, railings, and deck tates. Steam burst from ruptured pipes, water surged into shattered compartments. The lights flickered for an instant, and in that instant every man felt the same fear. Abner Reed had hit a mine, but this mine was perfectly placed, almost surgically so. The explosion tore the stern completely off the ship, ripping away the aft engine room, the steering gear, the after-living compartments, and dozens of men within. Seconds after the blast, the ship settled violently. The stern was gone entirely, severed from the main hull, drifting away into the darkness with men still trapped inside. A few survived long enough to surface, calling out into the cold water while their brothers threw lines and life rings, praying they could pull them in. The ship groaned like a wounded animal, listing hard to port while the sea poured in through the open wound. The first minutes after the explosion were chaos. Men scrambled for footing in smoke-filled passageways. Water gushed in from holes jagged and wide. Debris littered the decks, twisted metal hanging from frames that had once been smooth and solid. But amid that chaos, the training of the crew took over. Damage control teams sprinted toward the breach, carrying hoses, pumps, collision mats, and wooden shoring beams. They knew that any hesitation meant the ship would sink. They slammed watertight doors shut, hammered beams into place, rigged pumps to fight the flooding, and used whatever tools they could find to reinforce weakened bulkheads. In the engine species, the surviving engineers worked in suffocating heat, trying to keep the forward boilers alive. If even one boiler failed, the ship would lose power and become a dead hulk waiting to be claimed by the icy sea. Above deck, officers shouted orders through the smoke. While men fought to contain flooding, others searched for the wounded, carrying them to makeshift triage areas lit only by red flashlights. The cries of the injured mixed with the shouts of damage control teams, the hiss of steam, and the rushing surge of freezing seawater. Yet slowly, impossibly, the ship stabilized. She was still afloat, battered, bleeding, and half destroyed, but afloat. The missing stern made her look like a wounded animal limping through the water. A lesser ship might have sunk within minutes. A pre-war destroyer almost certainly would have slipped beneath the surface, taking most of her crew with her. But Abner Reed held on, her internal structure absorbing the blast, and her crew refusing to abandon her as long as she lived. A tugboat and supporting ships moved in cautiously, preparing to tow the crippled destroyer back to safety. The process took hours. The sea tried more than once to swallow her, but the men aboard refused to give up. They kept pumping water, reinforcing beams, patching leaks, and praying that the hull would hold. By dawn, the ship was still afloat, a miracle in the cold morning light. Though more than 70 men had been lost, her ship had survived enough for the rest to make it home. The tow back to port was slow, painful, and tense. At any moment, the forward section of the ship could have folded from structural stress. But she held. Together, ship and crew reached the base at Adoc, bruised but undefeated. Word of her survival spread quickly through the fleet, stories told in mess halls, on destroyer tenders, and across radio channels. Sailors shook their heads in disbelief. A destroyer that lost an entire section of her hull and did not sink? Many said no ship should have lived through that. A few joked the Japanese mine must have assumed she was already sunk when the stern disappeared because the rest of the ship refused to follow. Abner Reed was sent to Puget Sound for repairs, and what happened there became a symbol of American determination. The ship was lifted into dry dock, exposing the brutal wound where her stern should have been. But shipyard crews did not flinch. They tore away shattered metal,
cleared ruined compartments, and began the painstaking work of crafting an entirely new stern piece, piece by piece. The process took 90 days, 3 months of welding, riveting, scaling, installing, and testing until the new stern looked as though it had always been part of the ship. The crew returned to find their destroyer whole again, her silhouette restored, her power renewed, her scars hidden beneath fresh paint. What stunned observers was not just that she was repaired, but how quickly. The Pacific War did not wait for anyone, and America made sure neither did its ships. Abner Reed returned to combat, a destroyer reborn. Every man who stepped back onto her deck felt something they could not fully express: respect for the steel and for the brothers who kept her alive on that terrible night. The destroyer that lost its tail, but not its soul, had risen again, ready to face the fire of war, as if defying the ocean itself to try again.
Long before the tales of Stanley's surviving direct bomb hits, or Abner Reed living through the impossible loss of her entire stern spread across the Pacific, the men who built and served these ships understood something that outsiders rarely noticed. The Fletcher class was not just another wartime design. It was the answer to every failure, every vulnerability, and every brutal lesson the United States Navy had learned in the first years of the Pacific War. What these destroyers endured and survived was no accident. It was the direct result of engineering foresight, relentless training, and a culture aboard ship that treated survival not as luck, but as a skill. The design began with something simple but radical for a destroyer of its time: a beam significantly wider than previous classes. That extra width gave the ship stability in heavy seas, but more importantly, it provided room for reinforced internal frames, thicker longitudinal girders, and stronger deck plating. Even before the first Fletcher touched water, engineers argued that the Pacific would punish weak ships without mercy. Their solution was a destroyer large enough to absorb hits, yet light and agile enough to charge into battle with torpedoes and 5-inch guns blazing. The hull of a Fletcher did not crumple easily, and sailors could feel that strength in the way the ship rode the waves. A thicker deck meant bombs that penetrated might pass through without detonating in critical spaces. Something similar happened aboard Stanley. One of her bombs punched through but failed to explode. But the strength of the hull was only half the story. The other half lay in the compartments within. A Fletcher-class ship was divided like a steel honeycomb, each section sealed with watertight doors, each compartment with pumps and backup pumps. Engineers in Washington had insisted on redundancy at every step because they knew a single failure could mean a ship lost. The result was that even when water raced through a ruptured bulkhead, as it had on Abner Reed, the flooding could be isolated to a handful of compartments, allowing the rest of the ship to stay afloat. Even when electrical fires raged through wiring rooms, backup circuits rerouted power automatically. Even when the steering gear was destroyed, as it was on ships hit in later battles, the twin-rudder design allowed emergency steering to keep the ship from becoming a helpless target. To sailors on board, these features were not abstract engineering principles. They were the difference between living and dying. When explosions tore into the hull, men knew exactly which valves to shut, which compartments to reinforce, which pumps to activate, because their training had drilled the response into their muscles. The United States Navy had made damage control into an art form, a discipline treated as seriously as gunnery or navigation. Throughout 1942 and 1943, reports from the front showed the same truth again and again. Ships did not survive because they were lucky. They survived because their crews had practiced failure until it no longer surprised them. Every Fletcher carried dozens of damage control kits: wood for shoring, steel plates, portable pumps, axes, hoses, and emergency power cables. Teams drilled constantly, simulating fires, flooding, broken pipes, and smoke-filled compartments. Men learned to fight blind, with wet cloths over their faces and flashlights between their teeth. They learned how to brace themselves on shifting decks, how to weld plates while the ship rolled, how to plug holes using mattresses if necessary. There was a certain grim confidence that grew out of this training, a belief that no matter how badly the ship was hit, they would find a way to keep her alive. And time after time, that belief proved true. But the Fletcher class was also deadly. While she was built to survive, she was equally built to fight and keep fighting even when wounded. The 5-inch Mark 12 guns were the pride of her armament, firing at enemy aircraft or surface targets with unmatched accuracy. The anti-aircraft suite grew throughout the war, from single 20mm mounts to quadruple 40s and twin 50s, turning the destroyer into a floating wall of lead. The torpedo tubes allowed the ship to strike at Japanese cruisers and battleships despite her smaller size. But what made a Fletcher truly dangerous was that, even after taking damage, she could still unleash this firepower. With her broad hull, she remained stable enough for gun crews to keep firing even when compartments were flooded. When power lines were cut, backup generators allowed turrets and mounts to continue operating. Even with damage to the superstructure, the ship retained enough agility to weave through enemy attacks. Stanley proved this when she destroyed 3 aircraft after being hit. Abner Reed, before losing her stern, had already shown her resilience in multiple engagements. Some sailors said it felt as if these ships hated to stop fighting, as if they resented the idea of surrendering to damage. And perhaps the crews came to mirror the character of the ships they served. Every Fletcher-class destroyer fostered a strange bond between steel and flesh. The men believed in their ship, and the ship in some way seemed to return that belief. The culture aboard these vessels was unspoken but strong. You did not quit because the ship did not quit. You held your ground because the ship held hers. You fought not only with weapons, but with wrenches, shoring timber, and pumps, keeping the heartbeat of the ship alive no matter what the enemy threw at you. By late 1943, the Japanese began to notice it too. Pilots reported destroyers that should have been sinking but continued firing. Commanders noted ships that absorbed hits yet returned days later as if untouched. Rumors spread, calling the American destroyers stubborn, impossible, relentless. A Fletcher-class destroyer rarely died easily, and even when she did, she made the enemy pay dearly for every mile of ocean. The legend grew, and with every story told in mess halls and on dark mid-watches, with every report filed from battles across the Pacific, the truth became undeniable. The Fletcher class was more than a ship. She was a symbol of American endurance, a vessel designed by necessity, inherited by courage, and strengthened by the hands of the men who fought to keep her alive. Whether she faced bombs, mines, torpedoes, or fire, she carried her crew through battles where, by all rights, she should have sunk. And in doing so, she became something close to immortal. Steel and spirit bound together in the crucible of war, refusing again and again to die.
When the war finally shifted away from the Solomons and Aleutians and the vast Pacific battlefield rolled onward toward the Philippines and Okinawa, the Fletcher-class destroyers continued to serve at the front lines, but the stories of Stanley, Abner Reed, and dozens of others had already begun to echo across the fleet. Sailors aboard carriers, cruisers, even battleships whispered these tales during quiet midwatches, tales of ships that took hits that should have broken them. Ships that lost entire sections of their hulls, yet stayed afloat. Ships that fought back, even when wounded so badly that any other vessel would have already slipped beneath the waves. These were not just stories. They were reminders that the men who went to sea were not fighting alone. Their ships were fighting with them. The legacy of these destroyers was built in moments of chaos and terror, the kind of moments that defined a sailor's memory long after the war ended. In 1943 and 1944, thousands of young Americans learned what it meant to trust steel with their lives. They felt the deck shudder under their boots as guns roared. They felt the heat of fires licking along bulkheads, the sting of smoke cutting into their eyes, the shock of explosions throwing them sideways. And they watched as the ships beneath them refused again and again to let go of life. Many of those men would later say the same thing in interviews decades after the war. that a Fletcher did not feel like a machine. She felt like a living thing, loyal, stubborn, determined. When a ship saved your life, you remembered her. And when you saved hers, you carried a piece of her with you long after your service ended. The legacy of the unsinkable destroyers was also written in the shipyards that repaired them. Places like Mare Island, Pearl Harbor, and Puget Sound, where welders worked day and night shaping new ribs and plates for hulls that had been torn open. In those shipyards, thousands of workers poured steel into molds, hammered rivets into frames, and painted hull numbers on freshly rebuilt sterns. They too became part of the legend because they returned these battered warships to life faster than anyone believed possible. Abner Reed was not the only one rebuilt and sent back into battle. Many Fletchers that suffered massive damage returned within months, some even weeks. One ship, after being hit by a kamikaze, had its bow nearly sheared off, yet sailed backward to port before workers fitted her with a temporary replacement so she could rejoin the fleet. The legacy was not only survival, but rebirth. The Pacific War demanded endurance on a scale the world had never seen, but few expected destroyers, small, fast, and lightly armored by nature, to demonstrate this kind of perseverance. Yet again and again they did. They chased submarines through typhoon seas. They escorted vulnerable carriers through skies filled with kamikazes. They shelled beaches during amphibious invasions and fought night battles against Japanese destroyer squadrons that had trained their entire doctrine around such engagements. Through it all, the Fletchers stayed at the front. The war ended in 1945, but the story of the Fletcher class did not. Many of these ships served in the Korean War, firing the same 5-inch guns that had defended them in the Solomons. Some served in Vietnam. Others were sold or transferred to allied navies around the world. Mexico, Germany, Turkey, Greece, Japan, and even South Korea operated Fletcher-class destroyers long after the United States retired them. The last surviving examples sailed well into the 1970s and 1980s, and a few even later. For a ship designed in the early 1940s, this was extraordinary. The ships lasted because they were built with care and fought with devotion, but the true legacy was carried by the men who served aboard them. In the decades after the war, many of these sailors attended reunions, walking with canes or leaning on family members as they stepped onto museum destroyers, preserved as memorials. They ran their hands along railings they once gripped during battles. They stood on decks that once shook beneath them as bombs exploded. They stared out across calm harbors and remembered nights when the sky flashed white with flak and fire. Through tears or quiet smiles, they whispered to the steel beneath them, as if greeting an old friend. Some stood silently, letting the memories wash over them. A few brought their grandchildren, kneeling to explain how they had once fought aboard ships that seemed unbreakable, ships that refused to surrender even when torn open by war. In their stories, the vessels felt alive again. Stanley still firing into the night while smoke curled along her deck. Abner Reed limping home, missing her stern, but refusing to die. The countless other Fletchers that survived torpedoes, mines, bombs, collisions, fires, typhoons, and the relentless grind of war. Together, these ships formed a legacy unmatched by any destroyer class in history. The ending of this story does not fade into tragedy or triumph, but into something simpler and deeper, a sense of respect for what steel and human will can do when bound together in the crucible of war. The men who served aboard the Fletcher-class destroyers left behind no monuments carved in stone, but the ships themselves were monuments, their endurance, a testament to the unshakable spirit of the crews who fought, lived, and sometimes died aboard them. Many ships now rest quietly as museum vessels, or artificial reefs, or memories sunk into the deep. Yet their legacy lives on, in the unbroken chain of stories passed from sailor to sailor and generation to generation. Ships can rust, steel can bend, men can fall, but courage endures.